Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode of the show, we speak to Kira Kaplan about trauma education from a psychologist's perspective.
Kira Kaplan, welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Today, we're going to be chatting a little bit more about trauma education and what that is. Thank you so much for coming on board.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this.
That's an absolute pleasure. So just to give the audience a little bit of background, I came across you on LinkedIn, and I was really fascinated about the concept of trauma education. But more importantly, the fact that from what I could gather is you practice in 2 different countries. Am I correct?
Yes, that is my partner and me, Mario Naga and I, we came together a couple of years ago. We were asked to design a trauma education training for the German Children and Youth Foundation. And because we're both communication psychologists, we met at Schulz von Thun. He's a big communication psychologist here in Germany. And we both live in the town called Leipzig, and we really got along very well. And we designed these workshops, and they were within the program in 2015, 2016, when many refugees came from Syria and were very successful. But unfortunately, the program was ended. And we had so many people asking us, can you come to our school? Can you come to our agency? We need your support. And I looked at Mario and I said, let's do this. So we founded Yuva Leipzig. Yuva is Turkish and means the nest. And that's basically what trauma education is about. I'm a native Californian. I was born and raised in San Diego, California. And eventually I'd like to go back there. And I never knew what to do there professionally, because originally I'm a journalist and I speak German mainly. And I talked to a friend of mine, she's a coach, and I said, could you imagine that would be something I could do in the US as well? And she's like, oh, absolutely. So then COVID came along, and suddenly, the world has changed so much. And apart from many scary things, there have also been so many more options. So for me, the option was to try to get our workshops established. So we're way at the beginning. I've got a first big client, which is San Diego County. They want to work with us together. So I hope that, maybe even this year we can do our first workshops, possibly online, but soon also in person, then at the beach in San Diego, which is really what I want to do.
That's a really cool story. I mean,
right.
I remember all the trouble with Syria and that kind of thing. We actually had another guest on who's busy doing her doctorate. And her doctorate is in bite-sized psychology for victims of violence and refugees. Because she says, you saw people in the refugee camps and you had like 5 or 10 minutes with this person. You didn't know if you were going to see them again. So you had to give them those practical tools.
Right. So
I'm really interested to just get a bit of a better understanding. What is trauma education?
Trauma education is actually, the word says it, it's educating people on what is trauma, what is happening in our brain, what is happening in our body, what does trauma actually mean? What is it? Does every person who experiences something awful, are they automatically traumatized? No, they're not. That's on the one hand, the most important, what trauma education is, but it's also helping people who work with potentially traumatized or, let's say, vulnerable or emotionally challenged people, how to work with them every day. We from Yuva Leipzig believe that basically anyone who works with people should be trauma educated and should understand, because one big part of trauma education is also teaching people to self-regulate emotions, but also to be more stable and also to build up resiliency. So it's basically, on the one hand, focused at people who work with traumatized people. And on the other hand, we truly believe it should be for everyone. It should be mandatory, I think.
Look, I'm live in South Africa. I grew up in Zim, and I have to agree with you. I mean, being educated just in what trauma is and how you can help somebody that's gone through a traumatic experience has got to be a huge instance. I mean, if we look at what happened in the US late last week,
Yeah.
we've got to consider that these teachers need to be able to help these kids that have been traumatized, but more importantly, they need somebody to be able to help them from the traumatization
Definitely.
of school shootings.
Yeah, I was there last week actually when it happened, and I was sitting with my friend. She has two children. They're in first grade, and she was on her phone the entire time because the neighbor's school had received like a threat. And she was so scared. Am I going to bring my kids to school the next day or not? And a friend of hers was working at that school, and they were basically in lockdown for a couple of hours, not knowing if there might be danger outside or not. So yeah, definitely. I mean, you didn't have to be in Texas yourself to be a victim of trauma. I mean, just reading about it can trigger so much in any one of us. So yes, I think it's really important that everyone should understand, but also that you can prevent the risk, or maybe not prevent it, but you definitely can decrease the risk of being traumatized or developing a trauma disorder. And I think that's really important to know.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you understand trauma and you understand what the triggers are, or what the psychological or even neurobiological basics are, that definitely has got to be able to help when that situation arises, for somebody to be able to go, okay, hang on, this is what's happening, as opposed to just immediately hitting that fight or flight, response that they have no control over. And I think that, in my opinion, is often what leads to a lot more severe traumatic issues, because you're completely helpless in that situation because you don't have the skills or the understanding to process what is happening.
Well, first off, I think it's important to understand that, yes, a school shooting can be traumatizing, or it is definitely traumatizing. The question is, do I develop a traumatic disorder from it? Possibly, possibly not. There are different factors at play in there. But also, I myself am just going through a crazy separation from the father of my child. And this whole can also be traumatizing for my son. I'm in a big crisis right now. So I think we all have had some kind of traumatic experiences in our lives. And, the older we are, the more we know maybe ourselves and know how to cope with it. So that is on the one hand. And I think that we have like these, that we have our reptile brain, that we get into a fight and flight modus, or maybe even freeze, is really, really healthy, because our body is just designed to take over in certain situations. More importantly is what happens after a certain time, like if I've noticed, oh, I'm sorry, now the phone is ringing.
No problem.
1 second, I'm sorry. Now you have to edit something. Sorry.
No problem. We'll edit it out.
Sorry, I totally forgot to have a landline. There you go. No, I think it's really important to understand that our responses, the fight, flight, and freeze response, or lately people are also talking about fawn as a people pleaser, that they're very important for us in the immediate reaction of a traumatic event. The question is just what happens in the aftermath, after a certain time. And also just to be more self-aware. And then in the worst case, if you feel like, okay, this is not healthy, And if you're capable to reach out to people who are professional and they can help you, that's really important to know, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that it's very important for people to just understand when they need to reach out for help. So Kira, could you tell us what some of the maybe psychological basics are when it comes to trauma?
So what we do is that, I myself haven't studied psychology. I'm a journalist. So for me, it's really important to make complex things understandable. My partner, Mario Naga, she is a psychologist, so we work very well together. And we like to explain. So let's say, for instance, you walk through the woods. I don't know, are there woods or a forest or something where you live? No.
Okay, so
okay.
We've got the open felt land. So, if you consider
Okay, so
nobody in South Africa wants to go walking in the bush because there's lions and leopards and yeah.
Let's take, it's like dawn, it's maybe a park somewhere, and you walk through a park, and so you're all by yourself and the sun is already set, and it's you hear a strange noise. What happens in your body at that moment? Your whole body is like super sensitive. You can feel everything. Your ears are like two satellites. Your heart starts to beat much faster. Your breath is really flat and you breathe from your breast. And you're like, your whole body is on super alert. And then suddenly a little mouse just passes your way and your whole body goes, and you're relaxed, and you can go home and tell, your friends, yeah, you cannot believe what happened to me. I was walking through a park, and you can tell a story from the beginning to the end. So that's how we get stressed. We're out of our stress level and we calm down again. That happens to all of us. Someone who has experienced something very traumatic, they might kind of get stuck, I want to say, to make it simple, in this mode. We usually use these figures. So this would be the little reptile brain who can save us in certain situations. So they can get kind of stuck in this mode of, being super anxious. And what people cannot do is tell a story from the beginning at the end. From the beginning to the end, I'm sorry. So they will just have little fractions left. They might remember a smell. They might remember the feeling. They might remember like a noise or a color, but they will not be able to tell the entire story. So that's what happens to someone who's experienced, let's say, just a simple walk as very traumatic. And they will need to learn to put these little pieces together into one story. And if that's not capable, because it's not always possible, because a traumatic event could have been something transgenerational or something before you really cognitively were aware of it, let's say in early childhood. But they will eventually learn to know their triggers. And they will eventually, or can eventually, learn to cope with situations that might stress them. So I think that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, how we like to explain is how individual it is. So you and I are driving through South Africa. You drive on the other side, right? I think.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. So I've had bad experiences with that in Scotland. So let's say we're driving along and we have a minor accident, a little fender bender, and I'm not going to get in the car again. I'm like, no, this is it. Sorry, I'm never going to get back in. And you're like, oh yeah, sure, I can drive home. So how we judge a situation is so individual, and it just depends on our experience. So I think that's really important to understand, and that's basically what's happening in our brain. And this little guy here is so important because let's say he's just he is very fast. It's the reptile brain. He's really fast. He can react quickly. Let's say you want to cross the street, your reason is not very good when you want to cross the street and a car is coming. You're like, how fast is it and how long does it take him to, get into the brakes? So this guy will decide if you're to, well, you don't want to fight if you're a reptile against the car, but you might want to flight in that situation. Freezing could be dangerous too. So that's really important to understand. That's what all of us have, this reptile brain. The question is very individually how we judge a situation later and how we deal with it.
That really does make a lot of sense, because obviously if you have experienced a trauma that you haven't quite dealt with, your reptile brain's kind of going, okay, hang on, I've seen this before, and they're immediately putting that protective mode into place because,
right,
subconsciously that little reptile brain's already going, okay, hang on, I've seen this before. This is what I need to do to prevent that from happening again.
Right. Been there, done that. That helped last time, right? And that's the thing, when you deal with people who, let's say you work in a school or you're a social worker and you have teenagers or children, and they have experienced things in their life and they might not remember. But the problem is that people who have experienced something often might be traumatized or might be emotionally challenged. They, as you just said, in other situations where there's no danger, the reptile brain might take over and they might have, objectively really strange behaviors. And you're like, wow, where's this coming from? And why is that person getting so upset? What is this about? So they kind of confront us constantly what they have experienced in their life before, but they just know this way to react to a certain feeling or to a certain situation. So we teach our people in our workshops of Yuval Leipzig how to maybe see those signs and how to be more understanding and maybe question question the behavior of someone and say, okay, wait a minute, maybe there's something else going on. It's maybe not the obvious, So I think that's really important. That's one of the other concepts we use among the psychoeducation, understanding what's going on in the brain.
Now, I like what you said there about, if you've had some sort of trauma education where you're actually able to almost see, okay, this behavior doesn't quite fit this situation. Maybe there is something more. And as yourself, redirect or readjust the way you react in order to help put that person back at ease. Because,
right,
especially if it's an unresolved trauma, the moment you get up and defensive, it's just creating an even bigger barrier between you and that person. So
right, it can turn into a vicious cycle, basically. I lecture at a university, at the International University here in Leipzig. I've been teaching social workers communication, and we've been talking about attitude. And I think, the whole being trauma sensitive is also about attitude. So we were talking the other day and I told him, sometimes you'll get confronted with behavior. So I had one of my students was telling me it's like they're half at the university and the other half they're out in the field. And I had this young man who's working at an orphanage. And the deal is that there's this girl, she's 6 years old, and she's to see her mom every other week. Her mom is to come to the orphanage every other week, spend some time with her child. And then the mom goes back home and the child stays actually it's an orphanage, at the orphanage. And the mom, lately has not come by. I think in the last 6 possible visits, she only came once. And she would call last minute and say, oh, sorry, I can't make it. And her daughter, she was really sad and didn't understand. And my young student works at the orphanage and he got really upset about it. And I said, well, what could be good reasons for the mother not to show up? And for him, it was really hard. He was like, there can't be a good reason. She's an awful mother. So I said, well, why don't you sit down? Why don't you put yourself in the mother's shoes? And then I had him and the other students work on that. And they came up like, the mother's ashamed. The mother possibly has been in an orphanage herself and just has really bad experience. The mother's just really scared and frightened to take over responsibility. So they came up with a whole bunch of very good reasons, not out of the social worker side, but out of the perspective from the mom. And that actually opened it up that they could eventually talk with the mom and say, listen, what do you need to, meet your agreement that you see your daughter? What do you need? Do you want to meet her somewhere else? Where can we work on that? So I think not only understanding what happens in the brain, but also, as you said, understanding strange behavior and understanding there could be something behind it, and being understanding, not agreeing necessarily, but just having like the openness of understanding, I think helps a lot in terms of solving things.
No, I definitely agree with you on attitude and understanding. I mean, my wife was a paramedic for a long time, and unfortunately, she now does have PTSD. And it's like you say, with trauma, it can be anything from a sound to a smell to, the look of a person, and it triggers that. And for a long time, it took me a lot of effort to try and figure out that this wasn't my wife just being overtly dramatic or paranoid or any of that. This is somewhere there's this visceral flashback to whatever that situation was. And once my attitude changed and I could look at kind of what could be some of the reasons and how I could help, it definitely helped her. It hasn't cured the PTSD, but it's definitely having a little bit more education on my side has helped me to understand, okay, this isn't just acting out. We're back in a situation where mentally that trauma is fresh again, even if she can't remember exactly what happened. That smell has just triggered something. So I think attitude is very, very important for those of us around or dealing with somebody who we might not even know that they have suffered a trauma. They might not even know it.
Right. They might not even know. It could be, as I said, it could be transgenerational.
Yeah.
It could have been something so early in our childhood. And it can just also be a feeling, like the feeling of not being heard or the feeling of being neglected or ignored that can cause so much pain. And, you just jump to action. And also on the other side, as you said, like understanding your wife's behavior doesn't have anything to do with you. It's her behavior and it's not addressed against you. We call it the concept of the good reason. And until my separation, I would love to explain it to our workshop participants. I would say, so for many years, I've been asking my partner, could you bring out the garbage, please? And I'd be very creative. I would put the garbage in front of the door that he'd basically have to trip over it in order to bring it out. And, the garbage was still there. And for many years, I got really upset about it because I felt like, why is he just ignoring it? And does he want to tease me? And what is this, And then I learned the concept of the good reason. So now I ask my participants, so what could be good reasons for him not to bring the garbage out? And they've been very creative. They're like, oh, he's disgusted. He's scared. He doesn't like the smell. He's scared of, in Germany, you have to bring the garbage into the basement. He's like scared of mice and spiders. And eventually I understood, like, he won't wake up in the morning going, how can I, make Kira really mad at me? Because that would be crazy. So I understood out of his perspective, there are many good reasons for him. And for me getting upset, that has to do with me. That's not his problem. And, so I think the good thing about our trainings is not only understanding what happens in the body and not only understanding, okay, how to be more sensitive, more open, in dealing with people, especially if you don't know what's going on. You know, it could be the supermarket clerk just getting upset at you and you're like, whoa, what's going on? You know, who knows what kind of day she had, but it just really supports you in everyday life, and especially with people who are, you know, possibly challenged in some way.
I really like that concept of what is a
Thank
good reason. You know,
I love it.
because when you actually stop and think about, okay, what are some reasons that somebody could be behaving like this? It does actually, it slows your brain down enough to actually come up with a logical reason and gives you time to respond without reacting. And I think in human nature is we tend to react rather than slow down, listen, and respond.
Right.
Would you be able to, you know, what would be some almost practical educational tools that people could start using just to help them almost help somebody that may or may not have had trauma, but is kind of showing strange behavior, I think would be the best way.
Well, I think actually the two things I already mentioned. So on the one hand, understanding what happens in the brain, but also, and they're really good books. We've been using one, unfortunately, I don't have it right here. We've been using a very good book. It's also in English by Marianne Herzog, which explains what happens in the brain in a very easy way that we actually use that, for instance, with children. So my 6-year-old son can explain what it has to do with the reptile brain and the reason. And for people who are actually suffering from trauma, it's such a big relief to understand that their reaction is a totally normal reaction to a not normal situation. And that alone is, I think, a very, very important tool, just to know, wow, okay, what I experienced was not okay, and my body did the right thing, and my brain did the right thing, and I can get out of this. I think that's a very important tool. So not only understanding yourself, but also explaining it to someone. Then also the concept of the good reason in terms of attitude, because as you said, it brings you into a place of reacting differently, of seeing differently a situation, and then also, you know, working with an idea, not necessarily a diagnosis, because that's not really important. If you work with people or if you deal with people, you're working with them in the moment, here and now. You're not working with them yesterday. You're not working with them tomorrow. So it kind of opens up, okay, what can I do here and now? And then it helps you ask the right questions in terms of, what do you need? What would it take? You know, like opening it up and involving the person. I think those are the two very important tools. And one of the most important is the concept of a safe place, you know, offering people or helping people feel not only physically safe, but also psychologically safe. You know, we just a very small example. Marion Nagel and I, we were on our way to a workshop the other day at a rehab center. And we had like our suitcases with books and all our workshop tools. And we were looking around and we couldn't find the entrance. And then we called and said, we can't find it. Well, they told us, just take that elevator, but there were 3 elevators. And eventually we found the right one, but we were not able to push the right button. They had to bring us up. And I personally don't like elevators. And it took us like 25 minutes to find the, you know, the right floor, to find the people, and so on and so forth. And it was really tiring. And we thought, wow, how would that be for someone who's vulnerable, who's seeking help at a rehab center? There's no sign, there's no doorbell, they can't find it. Then, you know, and they're already insecure before they're even there. And then, you know, like, and that's just one of the things we like to give our participants, like, kind of think of what people went through before they came to your office, to your school, to your, whatever practice. What did they see? What did they experience? And how can you design it in a way that would make it, easier for them, and also safer in some way? It just has to be little things. You don't have to change everything. So that on the one hand, but also what can you do for yourself to be safe? Like when safety is like on the Maslow pyramid of needs, it's like the second level. So if we don't feel safe, we're all of us are automatically in this, high alert mode. And then this guy comes up, the reptile brain, and any of us. So what do you need to be safe in a situation? What can you do for yourself? As you just said, take a moment, breathe, just to access your own resources. I think those 3 methods are probably the most important, and also those that we teach.
It does make sense what you're saying there is about, if you are, as an example, a rehab facility, is take into account the people coming to you for your services are already in a vulnerable situation. So how do you alleviate some of that trauma and some of that vulnerability? Because it takes a lot of guts to admit I've got an addiction issue and I need rehab.
Right.
So, already there, you're vulnerable. And then to have the whole concept of, I can't find the place, I don't know where to go, it just adds. And obviously that in itself further impacts whatever therapy they're going to get, because.
Right.
So that does make a lot of sense. But then I'm just thinking on that, how does something like trauma affect learning or education in youngsters? I mean, if you are traumatized or have some sort of trauma, and especially in youngsters, because they actually don't know what's happened, how does that affect their education?
Well, people who have experienced something awful and might not even know it, as you said, that they often, or different. I've got another figure here we like to take along. So let's say this is your brain, okay? This is your brain, and up here on your brain, of course, we don't have this guy looking out, but on the sides of our head, we have the so-called amygdala. And the amygdala is something like a smoke detector all of us has, and he communicates, he kind of is like an alert and sees if something is going on or not. And he wakes up the reptile brain, and then the reptile brain takes action and fights, flights, or freezes. So people who have been traumatized, their amygdala is very sensitive and might give out alerts even though there's nothing to be scared of. There's no danger at all. And so imagine that in the brain of a young child. So if your body is like in a high alert state, it's really hard to learn things, as a matter of fact, because your body cannot do those two things at the same time. So the reptile brain is really fast. It's a really old part of our brain, but he can only do these 3 things. In order to learn, you need you need this part of the brain. You need your common sense. You need to be able to use logic. But with the amygdala being on high alert and the reptile brain like ready for action, you can't learn things. So especially for these children, it's really important that they learn how to stabilize themselves, how to calm themselves down, and in many ways, with art, with movement, with music, with dance. And it's so unfortunate, especially, I don't know how it is in other countries, but here in Germany, those are the subjects they've been cutting back on music, on physical education, on art, and it's so much needed. It is as important as math and reading and writing. And that's very unfortunate, because those are the things that actually stabilize emotionally, and they're important for our bodies, for our sensitivity. and not just for our cognitive understanding.
Yeah, I think it seems to be happening worldwide, where they are removing things like art and dancing and phys ed and those kind of things. And you're right, they are important, and especially for, there is a move at the moment. I'm seeing it a lot more in South Africa, where schools are starting to take into account the special learning accommodations for kids. So there are more schools now that are catering to children that might have neurological deficits or physical deficits. But what you're saying there there's nothing that I have seen that has, teachers equipped for how do you help a child who isn't acting out because they're naughty. They're acting out because something's triggered their reptile brain. And unfortunately, now that it's triggered, ABC isn't just going to work because they're not actually able to take the ABCs in, because they're sitting there ready to either run away, or they're actually frozen like a deer in the headlights because the reptile brain's taken over. I think it's very important that, for me, teachers should be educated in how to spot trauma, and from there, how to help a child or a student that may potentially have some sort of unresolved or unknown trauma, because otherwise that child's never going to be able to succeed at school. And then that just leads to the next cycle of, I'm not good enough. And that's when neurological deficits do start to come in, or psychological problems.
That's interesting that you say it. And I'm understanding that obviously in South Africa, that's also not on the curricula for educators. When Marion and I got together and founded Juva Leipzig in 2017 and went online in 2018, we said our vision is that should be part of, education for kindergarten teachers, for high school teachers. I personally believe it should also be important for anyone who works in any kind of, with any other people. We've been working, for instance, with the unemployment agency here in Germany. We just gave a training for journalists. And I do believe truly that should be mandatory. Not only for the children that already have problems, but also to support the others to, build their resiliency. Because schools have taken over so many important jobs, which used to be in the parents' hands, or should be in the parents' hands. But it's unfortunate not every parent has the time or capability to sit down and talk about feelings with their child and, meditate with them, or, actually experience things like go out and touch a tree and smell the flowers and play in the dirt. Unfortunately, that's not very common.
It isn't these days, especially the way the world's going and with economies and that kind of thing. You don't have that situation anymore where students finish school, go home, and there's a parent at home to help with homework or to discuss things with. It's now kids stay at school or aftercare and get home, and it's a mad rush to get everybody fed and bathed and homework done and into bed. That you're right, there just doesn't seem to be time to, common saying, stop and smell the roses. So yes, I very firmly think, like you do, that just teaching people, educating them on what trauma is and how they can spot it and react to it would definitely make a big difference. And even if it starts off in teachers should be educated with this. I think it's worldwide, but invariably a school has one guidance counselor. Guidance counselor can't help 300, 400, 500 kids that all might need one or two sessions because they're struggling with something traumatic. And especially,
and they only see them maybe once a week, so it's the everyday, and it's the everyday things. And it's also understanding that one child might learn it differently than another child, It's just, this is our little step towards it. I kind of hope that it would change by the time my son starts school. He's starting in September, and he's very lucky. He's in a very small school, and they start off singing. I remember when I went to school, we had a math teacher, and whenever he would have the feeling that we would get tired, he'd start to do push-ups with us. And some of the parents got upset at him and said, oh, they need to learn math. They can't do push-ups. But he saw, as you just said, the 1, 2, 3 didn't get into our brain because we were tired or exhausted. So he just kind of woke us up with some body to brain work, which was really smart of him. But it was not accepted in the 90s, and it's still not accepted right now. So it's,
Actually, that's quite an important point that you brought up, is that body to brain function is, how would somebody who has gone through a trauma, knows they've gone through a trauma, and sort of start seeing that, they're reacting to a situation, how do they almost practice that self-care or facilitate resilience against that trigger that's popped up? What advice or what tips or tools would you say to somebody to help them practice that self-care?
Well, I think, first of all, it's very individual, obviously. So, depending on how my constituency is, depending on what kind of trauma, is it just like, was it a single event? Was it multiple events? It's very, very individual. And that's why the work with a therapist is really important. But same thing there, probably worldwide, we do not have enough therapists. The waiting lists are crazy, and there are not enough therapists specialized on trauma. But now the good news is that someone who's trauma educated can actually support someone who is trying to find out. So what, let's say a person or let's say a teacher or a social worker could help do a trigger list. Okay, or also just observing, let's say a child who's experienced a traumatic event, just observing it without judging it. Okay, when do the strange behaviors happen? What does a strange behavior look like? When does the strange behavior not happen, which is also important, like in which situations? What happened before? What happens after? Is it maybe let's say every Monday? Is it at a certain time of a day? Is it maybe connected to the weather outside? So it requires a lot of observing and also reflecting on the one hand, and then maybe finding out the triggers. What could those be? Which is obviously not easy. And then as you just said, there are many small methods of regulating. So when someone realizes, okay, my stress level is increasing, there are these tapping methods, for instance. Staying grounded is very important. Some people have like a rubber band on their arm, where they kind of take away or like refocus onto like the pain. That can help, that you give them a rubber band, and when you teach them that when you feel this feeling coming, that that the reptile is coming, use the rubber band and kind of snap yourself out of the situation. But you really have to try. It's a try and error to figure out. And sometimes it's like 3 steps ahead, and then you fall back 5. But there are many simple methods. If you, let's say as a teacher, and you see someone is kind of falling out and you're dealing with the reptile, the most important is slowly to get them back into the here and now, reorientating them and then grounding them. It can be clapping, or snapping, getting them back here, or simply asking them, what's your name? What day do we have? Or address them with the wrong name can just help them to get back into the moment. And once they're there, they need to be stabilized, which doesn't mean like touching them, but, they're like, as I said, tapping or rubbing off the body. It really has to do a lot to do with body work. That could help.
Yeah, all of that does make a lot of sense. And especially the fact that, like you said, it is going to be trial and error. Every person is different. Not everybody experiences trauma the same way. So there isn't a one shot fix it all, here's a pull and you're okay. But,
right.
You need to sort of start taking the time and just going through the different methods and seeing what works for you as an individual.
Right. It could be a song, for instance, but for someone else, it could be not the right song. It could actually trigger something. It's really hard. It needs a lot of patience. And, as you just said, so many of our clients come to us and say, well, I've got this situation. What can I do? And we're like, you can try this, you can try that, you can try that. We don't know. And then, it's, as you said, it's very individual.
Yeah. But I think it's important for people to understand that, there isn't a one-stop, one fix for everything. And
right.
Especially if you consider there are so many different things that could cause trauma. Something that could be traumatic for one person isn't traumatic for another. So it is going to be trial and error. It is going to be take your time and seeing what works for each individual. So, people also need to understand that it's not going to be fixed overnight. And
right.
most neurological or psychological things aren't fixed overnight anyway. So it's going to take
and
constant
the
work.
thing is, I don't think it needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
People ask us, so can you heal trauma? I know there's some researchers that say, yes, it can be healed. We personally don't believe it can be healed, but it can be part of your life,
Yeah.
So let's say you've had cancer and you survived cancer, and then you go out and which can also be obviously a traumatic event, and then you go and found a support group. And you kind of make sense of it. And then you go out and help other people. Then the cancer has become part of your life. And you've even, made something good out of it. I think that's what other people might understand as healing. And I think that's important. And some people just never get to that step, but they might cope, which is also absolutely okay. As long as they get through life in a healthy way or in a good way for themselves without harming themselves or harming other people. And I think that shouldn't be judged either.
Yeah, I think it's very important, that concept that trauma doesn't get healed. You learn to
I believe.
live with
I know
it.
other people would say it differently.
I don't think so. I think trauma is something very similar. It's like grief. The grief will always be there. It's just, it's not this giant ball taking up this tiny jar anymore. It's, the jar's now big enough to hold the grief and there's space. And I think trauma is something very similar to that. You're never cured of the trauma. You don't get over the trauma. You just learn how to cope with it so that it doesn't become this all-consuming part of you. And I think people do need to remember that some stuff, even if you break a bone, you can heal a broken bone, but there's always going to be the reminder that you broke the bone. The scar's always going to be there. Same with trauma, same with grief. It's always going to be there. It's how you learn to cope with and deal with it that makes the difference. And it's how the people around you understand what trauma is and understand, okay, this is out of the ordinary. How do I help? That's what's going to make the difference. That's what's going to make the change, as opposed to where we are now, where we have this constant thing of, just get over it.
Right. I just meant to say it, this attitude of, oh yeah, I'm sorry. Well, you're going to be better in a couple of weeks. You just get over it. This too will pass. Well, of course it will pass, but will be a part of my future, whatever it is. And that makes a person, or is part of my new personality, definitely, and how I see the world and how I live in the world and how I act in next situations. Yeah,
because the way you react to situations in the future is based on similar examples of situations from your past. So, what happened in your past is part of what created who you are today.
right.
So if there was a trauma, it is going to be a part of that personality now. Even if you're dealing with a trauma, it's still part of that personality. So last question.
Yeah.
If a therapist or somebody wanted to explore the area of trauma education, as a special area of interest within their practice or their coaching, and what would you suggest to them as a place to start, or what advice would you give them?
If someone themselves would want to be a trauma educator, or
if somebody wanted to become a trauma educator, where would you suggest they start, and sort of what advice would you give them?
Come to Juba, Leipzig. No, well, yeah, that too, of course, but actually, I don't know of other countries. I know in Germany it is a certified training, advanced training, as a matter of fact. I know in Switzerland as well. Interestingly, I haven't read of any English speaking countries that they teach something like trauma education, where you can get like a specific advanced training or certificate in being trauma informed. You can do a lot of workshops. I think, that's a good question. I think probably, I would probably say listening or reading Oprah Winfrey's and Dr. Perry's book would be a good start to even understand what's going on in our body, what can cause trauma. I think that would be like a good lecture. Basil van der Kolk would be great. Peter Levine would be great to kind of, Stephen Porges would be great to deal with all these researchers in terms of understanding how trauma can affect our body. And then I think in the next step, practicing how to create a safe place. I think that's what I would probably tell someone, how they could start, what would be a good start, or honestly just reaching out, and we're happy to find ways and support people and in a 2-day workshop or come to South Africa or wherever.
What that I think is so important, but what I'm definitely going to do is just cite those sources within the show notes, because I think trauma is a subject that is so huge, and there isn't a person on the planet that can say they haven't experienced some kind of trauma. And obviously, you've had some people that have experienced trauma on this scale and some on this scale, but just understanding how it works, I think, is a huge step already in just almost creating that environment where people are actually comfortable about talking about these things. And that, for me, I think is one of the biggest things that we do need to start understanding, is people do need to be mindful. We do need to be aware that not everybody has had a lifetime of sunshine and daffodils. Some people have had something happen or have experienced something, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of gentleness to help that person see that, they're not abnormal or out there or weird. We've all experienced it. We just might have experienced it differently or reacted to it differently. And, we all react differently to the sun. Some of us go outside and burn bright red, and others tan, and some of us can go and stand in the sun for a decade and are still as pale as all. So, I mean, if we all experience sunshine and we all react to that differently, it makes sense that we all react to something like trauma differently.
Definitely. And I think what you just said is also very important. And it kind of connects also to Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication. It's just attitude of, you know, of people that we all do things to, or whatever we do, however we act is basically to fulfill our needs. And I want to say it's most likely always beneficial, even though it might not seem that way. You know, I think it's just this very humane believing in the good in other people, and however they react is just, you know, a reflection of maybe the not so good they've experienced. And I think trauma education is really not only the tools, yes, that too, and not only the understanding, but just this whole very mindful and peaceful and understanding attitude that lays behind it. And I think it would make this whole world a better place. I don't know if I'm still not giving up hope.
I actually couldn't agree with you more on that topic. I think the more people are mindful and the more people are aware that things do happen and that there is, you know, everybody is born good. So the way people react or the way they act is because of something that may have occurred that they might not even be aware of. So
Right.
Just a little bit of kindness goes a long way. I mean, the simple thing my mother always says is it costs you nothing to smile at the person in the checkout aisle who's been sitting in the supermarket since it opened. They've been there for a 12-hour shift, and they've probably had everybody under the sun just kind of grunting their way through. Just smiling and greeting somebody by their name makes a huge difference. So taking a little bit of time and just understanding that somebody might be going through something that you don't know about, a little bit of kindness goes a long way.
Right.
So is there anything that you think we may have missed around the topic of trauma education that you would just like to let people know about? Obviously, I will include your contact details and details of Uwe Lipsic in the show notes that people know how to contact you and can get a little bit more information. But is there anything you think we missed?
Well, I think it's also importantly, we looked at all the people who might have experienced something awful, bad, and so on and so forth. I think it's also, especially for people who deal with vulnerable or emotionally challenged people, to understand that they themselves are putting themselves out there, like your wife, as you said, you know, and that they can be affected by so-called secondary traumatization. I think that's also really important to understand, that you don't necessarily have to have witnessed an event you yourself in person. It can be transgenerational. It can be through media, social media. It can also be just because you've been working with people, you know, night and day, who are so vulnerable that you actually catch their trauma, and you can develop the same symptoms. And I think that's really important also to understand in terms of trauma education, mindfulness, you've got so many helpers out there, and they're so important. And I don't know how would have gotten through the last 2.5 years, especially with the worldwide pandemic. And at the same time, these people they've done an amazing job, but they've also did not take good care of themselves. And I think that's really important also to understand. You know, self-care is important. Self-care is not just, you know, lighting a candle once every 6 weeks and, you know, putting on nice music and laying in the bathtub. it's more than that. It's in the everyday things. And I think if you yourself are in a good place, you can also be good and helpful for others.
I think that is so, so true. I mean, we recently chatted to a psychologist about mindfulness, and she said very similar is, although it's difficult to train yourself to be mindful and be present, in the moment, you need to take some time every day just to look after you, because if you're not looking after you, you can't look after anybody else.
Right.
But I think more importantly, the thing that struck me there is that you can actually pick up secondary trauma. And whilst you were talking, I sat and thought about it. I don't know if there's anyone in our generation that didn't feel the effects of things like the death of Princess Diana or 9/11 or the tsunami in 2006. These were all huge worldwide, huge events that happened thousands of miles away from most people, yet everyone can almost clearly remember where they were when that news hit. And, that time period seems to be a bit of a blur. And that's almost that secondary traumatic reaction to. So it makes sense that you can take on secondhand trauma, especially if you are in, the pandemic. If you are on those front lines and you've been in those hospitals, you're taking on the family trauma, the trauma of those patients. If you're not looking after yourself, you're going to wind up in a worse situation. So that's actually...
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much for doing this.
I'm thanking you so much. This was I've been really looking forward to speaking with you and getting to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I've been looking forward to it as well. And I'm just really glad we actually got a chance to meet up. And I think it is such an important subject. I think...
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Especially in the world we live in at the moment, I think just understanding trauma a little bit better and how you can help people goes a really long way to making the world a better place. So thank you so much for being on board with us.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you and seeing you. And maybe someday I can come down to South Africa.
Definitely.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.